And go ahead and flip to the next slide, Sarah. I'm glad we're starting with this first question, particularly after seeing the variety of roles that people are playing at different levels in the education system who are listening into this conversation. So I'm excited to hear your thoughts on this. So structural inequities, kind of those reflected in policies, resource allocations, and power dynamics. And then the personal and interpersonal biases are both complex barriers to change. And can you share some insights about confronting them at multiple levels of education? And Kyron, I think I'll start with you and then shift to Sharif, and then we can follow up with the research team.
Thank you very much. I think the main thing is just to be able to have an open and honest conversation about these barriers that exist. Often, I don't think we have the opportunity to really talk about these things. We know that they're there, but no one wants to have the discussion because we're concerned about hurting someone's feelings or someone taking it personal. But I think it just starts with having the conversation, talking about implicit bias, talk about the fact that resources aren't even distributed to maybe the south side of a district to north side, magnet schools versus non-magnet. I think just having the conversations with an emphasis on equity and just open dialogue is going to be the solution to this issue.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I think even as a principal, our interview questions included things about race, class, and power and privilege. What does it? We would ask, how do those things show up? You're a white woman about to teach in a school that is 99% Black. How does that manifest? If they said, oh no, it doesn't matter, I don't have to think about that, I don't see color, all those were red flags, because what that means is they're not recognizing the realities on the ground. They're not recognizing the lived experiences and lived experience that they could use to help accelerate achievement. And so that, with that being the groundwork, but I think it still has to start with leadership, how people, how principal supervisors, how district leaders start those conversations. And without that, it's really hard to do. I've consulted with organizations who, with districts where they have not spoken. They're concerned about the attrition rate of Black teachers in particular schools, but they shied away from having a direct conversation. But they're engaging me into solving the problem. I'm like, but you're not even talking about this with, sharing the data with this affected school. Like, that doesn't make sense. So you can't run away from the problem. You have to be, everyone's talking about safe spaces. We need more brave spaces in this arena.
Is it our turn to talk? Okay.
Yeah, go ahead, Curtis.
Well, I think insights into confronting at multiple levels. What we've been focused on since our reports have been released and over COVID is developing grassroots understanding of what our research is showing and having conversations with groups, and specifically in Milwaukee, which a lot of our research is based in schools in Milwaukee, and trying to give educators the tools and the community members the tools through which to have empowered conversations with their district and hold them accountable for the effectiveness of schools that their kids are in. And so this is, we've nothing that we've reported here is as far as the inequities in school organization as far as race inequities is at all surprising to anybody I've ever talked about. But what we've shown is we actually have some hard numbers attached to this that show how far we are away from equity. And the groups that we've talked to can now use these reports to force school boards to have conversations with them about what they're doing for change. Because having conversations with school districts themselves has gotten us not very far.
Katie or Marlo, anything to add from your perspectives?
Oh, echo a bit about Curtis's point just now about talking with grassroots organizations, particularly when considering slow or lack of response from leadership entities. I mean, when I think about ways to be able to confront structural inequities, the only ways that I've seen that have been able to result in change, or that I've experienced that have been able to result in change, are through grassroots resistance and organizing. And that can happen with, you know, us educators and researchers, as well as with the young people that we work with and that are within the schools. Together, youth and adult organizing, the partnerships that can happen within education, the ground that is able to move, particularly when it comes to confronting structural inequities. I don't know, my experiences have shown that not necessarily effective, but it definitely is the, I guess, the go-to way of making sure that people know how you're feeling, what the reality is, and what the expectations are, right? And it's not a secret, it's open, it's out in the open, and it's out in the conversation.
Thank you. And I'm glad you all brought up open communication and open conversations, open and explicit conversations about race, anti-racism, equity. And a few of those things actually came up earlier in the webinar when we invited participants to tell us what they viewed an inclusive environment for Black teachers were. So connecting kind of the open conversations, open communication to this idea of building trust among educators and families, all the way up and through the education system. I'm wondering if you all have, based on your experience, thoughts or strategies for creating those brave spaces, as you mentioned, Sharif, and getting those conversations going.
I mean, I can start off. I think it's such an important question. I've spoken to people, you know, from around the country. There's so many people who are very interested in recruitment. It's almost like, you know, oh, I'm out for the hunt. I'm going to look for these teachers, even if they're not really looking, even if they're just opening the door and hoping that someone comes. But what I think people need to spend a lot more time with is what are the prerequisites for a Black teacher to stay? What are the prerequisites? What are the conditions where this space is non-hostile? I think that starts off with listening, getting the feedback from people, whether it's from exit interviews, whether it's from people on the ground. Like if we can recognize that, you know, the strains and the racial stress of growing up Black in America, being a Black person in America, we shouldn't have these naive notions that just disappears when that Black person enters a school district or a school or a classroom. So we have to recognize some of those same stressors exist within our buildings, and we have to literally humble ourselves and reflect on it, but also ask and be listeners, not to respond, but to try to understand and seek understanding. And I think getting that feedback on a consistent basis, you know, implementing the feedback loop as far as what is the experience, how do you experience being a Black person in this school, in this district? And not enough people are asking those questions. And that's the same type of question we can ask in our teacher colleges, right? Like, are Black students finishing, you know, and what is their experience being this single Black teacher in their class? Or which later on they may be the single Black teacher in their school.
Kyra, Curtis, Katie, or Marlo, anyone want to respond to that or add their thoughts?
I agree with Sharif. I think one of the most important things that I mentioned earlier is just that comprehensive needs assessment, just talking and seeing exactly what it is that people need and just recognizing the experience. I was talking with someone earlier, and I was sharing with them that for Black teachers, administrators, et cetera, we're constantly wearing a mask where we have to code shift all the time. And that often isn't reality for our white colleagues. So for me, as a Black male, if I go into a room and if my voice raises, I'm aggressive, I'm intimidating, I'm threatening. My wife is an engineer. She's a female engineer. If she goes into a room and she's too quiet, then she doesn't know anything. If she's talking too much, she's the angry Black woman. So just understanding our experience that others really can't see because they're not in our shoes. Just really having that empathy and just seeing what is it that we need. Maybe people don't realize that they're perceiving us that way, but it often happens, and I see it all the time, which is why many teachers, administrators, et cetera, just feel marginalized. I talk to so many teachers that eat lunch by themselves. They've had one teacher that says she goes out to her car to eat lunch because she doesn't feel set with everyone to have lunch. So just really trying to understand the experience of what it's like to be a Black male or a Black woman.
Yeah, and I think everything that Sharif and Karan were saying was absolutely true. You know, the question is what recommendations you have for people creating inclusive and anti-racist environments for Black teachers. I mean, create them, start talking about it, start having conversations. If you're a school, start having conversations with your teachers about those topics, and start normalizing talking about these things. People aren't good at talking about it. You know, educators, everybody, we're not good at talking about these things. And like a Midwest nice doesn't go very far for addressing these issues. So we need to talk about them. We're not going to get it right, you know, the first time we talk about it. We're not going to have the right language. We need to have a safe space in every school to talk about these things and get used to doing it and being authentic with each other. And then, you know, you need direction on doing that, but it starts there. If you're not doing that, you're not doing anything.
Thanks, Curtis. And I think that transitions us to the next two questions, and maybe we can actually take them together. So in terms of kind of immediate next steps for those who are listening, I was just looking through the chat box, and there's some interest in learning more about Grow Your Own programs, or there were kind of there was a couple other things. The role of leadership, state agency leadership, district leadership. When you think of next steps, kind of what would you recommend, and what are some of the challenges that we may face in those next steps, and if you have any recommendations or experience about how to address those challenges?
Well, I'll jump in. I think, you know, I was glad to see people mention Grow Your Own, paraprofessionals. I think one of the things that we did in Pennsylvania was really kind of draw a pipeline. Research for Action had, you know, actually used a pipeline as this analogy and drew a picture and all the exit points. And so, you know, when we look at, you know, the experiences that Black children are having in school, that needs to be addressed. College and career readiness, whether they're finishing college, you know, all of that were the normal things. But one of the things that people hadn't looked at were the tens of thousands of people in Philadelphia and across the state who started, Black and brown people who started college but didn't finish. That's a huge group of folks that are rarely engaged about, you know, and we talked, someone asked about the state agencies, you know, what are their ways that there could be coalitions within a state or within a region to support people who started school. Maybe they got to their sophomore, junior year in life circumstances, they ran out of money or whatever, and they couldn't finish. What percentage of them may be interested, if they got support, to enter a school, you know, and look at teaching as a career? They would be career changers, but they also need to finish school. So that level of support. And I think, you know, as far as the question of like, what do we anticipate facing? One of the things that makes me nervous are two things. One, if we're successful in recruiting more Black teachers, but none of the other conditions for teaching and learning are addressed, and so then the Black people become the scapegoat all over again. We already have a tendency in the education field to blame children and communities. And so now we're like, oh, we got more, we're not going to address equitable funding, we're not going to address you know, asbestos, disengagement, any of that. And we're just gonna say, oh, just throw more Black people at the problem instead of fixing the root, right? And sometimes when I look at educational justice, it's this tree. And instead of people addressing the roots, they're happy and content to prune the branches and say, yo, we addressed the problem. No, you have to address the roots. The other piece that I'm concerned about that is a little bit of success, people will get satisfied. And you can't be hungry and satisfied at the same time. In Philadelphia, 40% of the classroom teachers used to be Black. People are just like, oh, it's fine. Today, that number is 24% because it wasn't tended to, it was ignored, and it was assumed that everything was okay. People have to tend to the work. all the way through the end and not get disengaged from it at all. So those will be some of my concerns.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
That's okay.
Oh, I think that we need to take a careful look at reevaluating the teacher certification process. Someone mentioned in the chat, there are a number of paraprofessionals, instructional assistants, et cetera, who will be phenomenal teachers. However, they do not have the financial means, nor do they want to take a year off to do an internship to become a teacher. I wonder if we could start offering more provisional certificates, look into some funding to assist people with tuition. I've run into quite a few phenomenal assistant teachers who could become teachers, but just don't have the funding. So I think that's an option that we really need to consider if we really want to look at increasing the pool and encouraging Black teachers to enter into the field.
Katie?
I was just going to elaborate a little bit on, I think, what's been shared. And to Sharif's point, just say, like, just focusing on recruitment is not enough. I know that what we've talked a lot about is the culture of the school. The other aspect is for the teachers. If we're not changing the culture of the school and we're asking these new teachers to enter a hostile environment, there's, that seems ethically wrong. And then also just thinking again about the, if we're not changing the culture of the environment, and so we have an environment that our data is showing that teachers are leaving in 2 years or less, then think about the students that are left in that building who don't have that option. And what are they experiencing on a daily basis? So just sort of elaborating on the point of recruitment's not enough, that it has to also focus on the culture aspect.
And one thing I guess I'd like to point out with this is that if you think about Wisconsin, for instance, you've got 95% of its teachers are white. The achievement gap between Black and white students lays a lot more at the feet of the instruction and the abilities of white teachers to teach Black students than it does for the fact that we don't have enough Black teachers. We're a long way away from having enough Black teachers. We should do that, but we need to work with our white teachers so that they don't blame parents, they don't blame students, for a behavior problem, and they don't interpret, just regular behavior as a behavior problem. And that to me, I think this is obviously really important, but before we can get there, we're not going to get there for a while. We need to make sure we don't lose the current generation of Black students and work with our white educators so that they understand their own bias. And then part of that process would mean, in a way, if we do that well, then we're creating an environment where Black educators might actually want to be, where Black individuals might actually want to be educators, as a natural process. Students will graduate high school and will have will have better experiences with their teachers, and they won't look at this as something that they don't want to do, or as many. So, we have to kind of go to the root of it, where we have our current students, if we ultimately want to have enough Black educators to serve the next generation of students.
I think another thing in terms of serving the next generation of students, one of the things we run into in Wisconsin a lot too is that equity work is only for the districts that serve predominantly students of color. We have several large districts, and that's where predominantly the students of color attend. And then we have a lot of predominantly white rural districts. And we find a lot of hesitancy or even just outright pushback from some of those districts that that's not their work. And I think the other thing to focus on is that this isn't just for schools serving students of color. It's good for all schools and all students. All students benefit from having educators of color, and also focusing on equity even in 100% white schools is good for future generations, because we have to disrupt the perpetuation of ongoing systems of oppression. And that has to start by having the conversations with white students as well. So I just want to make sure that we also put that out there.
Yeah, thank you, Katie, for that. And there's been some chat around culture and climate. I think that's important in all of our classrooms, in all of our schools, and all of our workplaces. Sharif, I'm wondering if you can expand on some of the things you mentioned in the chat box as well.
Oh yeah, I mean, people are making so many good points. I'm kind of
Yeah,
responding.
no, thank you.
I don't know which one to really chime in on, but what I would say is the students that we've worked with, you know, so we would have this Why I Teach tour, and we'd visit high schools to speak to students to see if they were interested in teaching. Some of them said, yeah, like I've always wanted to, but I didn't know how. You know, I babysit, but that's not teaching. And so what we wanted to do was create a program where they have a paid apprenticeship. There were always students who would say, my experience is so problematic, I'm so miserable. Even if I like the idea of teaching, I can't imagine coming back to a school. Chris Emden described it as returning to the scene of a crime, you know, that was committed against yourself. That's the feeling that a lot of Black children have returning to schools. And so what we would do is speak to them about consider two things. One, well, actually three, and it seemed to work because 100% of the students that we work with say that they want to teach Black children, and 90-something%, if they became teachers, 90-something% said they are more interested in becoming teachers than after our training program, than they did before. The three things are: one, consider becoming a teacher you wish you had and knew you needed. Two, if you had a miserable experience, your younger sibling, your younger neighbor, your own children may be in that very seat, and you may be able to change it. You may have a hand at impacting it. And then the third one, which seemed to be extremely powerful for them, was the same thing that attracted me to become a teacher, was connecting racial justice, social justice, and educational justice. Many of our youth are activists. They are, you know, vocal about what is just, what is fair. And when I think sometimes as educators, we try to protect them from, you know, the issues around funding. They know in general, yeah, we don't get the same money, but not the details, right? And so making sure that part of their education is seeing all the patterns, the history of education, and then them realizing that they could be a part of addressing it and being an educator activist really seemed to, you know, inspire and resonate with them. And we found, you know, this is our third year having a teacher apprenticeship, which is national. We have students all around the country, and they've been doing a phenomenal job. And they also experience self-efficacy because they actually experience students getting better, you know, so they say, oh, this child learned this skill, this reading skill, and I'm a sophomore in high school and I taught them that, right? What better way to help a student envision themselves as a leader of a classroom?
Thank you. And we're going to have to move on shortly, but Kyron, I want to give you the opportunity to have the last word as part of this panel discussion.
I just think that positive culture and climate is at the foundation of academic achievement. And I've said that plenty of times. Many people don't agree. I know we constantly push making AYP academics, but when we're dealing with kids who may have got kicked out of the house last night because mom got into a fight with boyfriend, or kids that don't have food and have other issues related to mental health, we have to deal with culture and climate and making sure that our kids and families are meeting Maslow's hierarchy of needs before we can ever start to think about academics. So that would be the thought I'd like to leave with. Just continue to focus on culture and climate and the mental health and social emotional well-being of our children and families.
Thank you, Kyron. I really appreciate this conversation. I'm going to thank you all again in a few slides, but a huge thanks for sharing your expertise with us right now. I'd encourage you all to continue to use the chat box if you have any quick follow-up questions.